Auto's on. Hi, I'm Bob Doyle, the information philosopher. I'm webcasting to you from my ITV studio here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The topic of my lecture today is up on the big screen, and I can zoom in on a close-up to show you our blog post. What's on this screen is the blog post on my information philosopher blog at i-phi.org. And I'm going to be using that blog to announce the topic for today, usually in the morning of the lecture. I think about it a lot. I was planning to do another lecture on free will because it's Tuesday, but something happened yesterday that set me working all morning on the question of information, which is the basis of my information philosophy. I'm arguing that we have to get beyond logic and language and words as a way to understand the world, because the world is not made out of words. Most of our philosophy is made out of words, and my lectures are entirely words coming to you in English over the internet at the moment. But what is the connection? And when I speak some words, I am meaning something, I am intending something. There is what's regarded as an internal kind of intention that is what's happening with a speaker. And then there's an extension, which is, among other things, the things I'm speaking about and the person I'm speaking to, which is something out in the world compared to the intention, what's going on in my mind. So let me enlarge this, take it to your screen so you can look closely at what just happened today. In response to a commentator's question, today's lecture is more great problems and metaphysics than it is free will. But I'm hoping that the lecture will also serve to show how the information philosopher website should work for its users. So let me scroll up a little bit and repeat what I just said, that information philosophy hopes to go beyond language and logic because words are always ambiguous and they depend on their context. So as I speak to you, everything you're trying to understand from my words is surrounded with the context of me. You see me, I'm speaking English. If you're in Thailand or Zimbabwe, well, Zimbabwe's English, you'll be okay. But if you're in a land where you are not a native English speaker, you really lack the context that's needed to understand my lecture. And if you're not a professional philosopher, we may go into some deep concepts during this lecture that may just escape you. And I'm going to do my best, both speaking to you now and then presenting web pages on my information philosopher website that should contain everything you need to know to go beyond what you're hearing from me and into what is written by the great thinkers. Now, in this case, the great thinker of importance is Gottlob Frege. And Frege is an amazing person. Arguably, Frege and Charles Sanders Peirce are the two individuals, the only two individuals to make an advance on the science or subject of logic, which came down to us from Aristotle virtually unchanged for 2,000 years. The scholastics used it, the Renaissance, the modern philosophers from Descartes down, all used that logic until Gottlob Frege and Charles Sanders Peirce. So we're talking about a very important person here. And I've chosen him to answer a question from one of my commentators. Now, in the subject of commentators, I'll just open a parenthesis and point out that I have not yet figured out how to get all the comments that are coming to me from my lectures on YouTube and or on Facebook. I'm working on this. I need to study the whole tool set out there that I'm now using. I've built this studio. I know a lot about the technology of multiple cameras and the ability to, as you've seen, go to have a surface in front of me which contains my website and various pages from my website that I can bring up selectively to this screen and then the whole screen. So I hope you'll be able to read everything I've written. But remember, this is presenting to you a website that you can access all on your own. You can go to Information Philosopher. Let me bring that to the screen for a moment. Later on, we'll be specifically looking at the web page on meaning. But here, you know, there are drop-downs to the famous great problems that I'm dealing with in my book on great problems. A lot here on the problem of knowledge, values, free will, the problem of the mind, which is a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, some things on chance that I'm still working on, and an enormous number of pages and problems in the area of quantum physics, okay? So let's come back to this blog post, and I say that knowledge can be defined, all right? Let me take it to your screen. It can be defined as information in minds that is a partial isomorphism. An isomorphism is the same shape, the word means. It's a partial mapping between what's in my mind as I think and the thing I'm thinking about. So somehow there's information in my mind which has some sort of connection to, for example, say, a circle. Now, it doesn't at all mean, or it doesn't at all require, that there be a circle in my brain somewhere embodied as information about circles, or a perfect circle, as Plato would have put it, okay? But there does have to be something in my mind which has recorded my past experiences during my development, my past experiences that involved circles. And when I think about a circle, when I use the word circle, when I see another example of a circle, my mind in my brain is tickling those neurons, causing neurons to fire, which connect to all my old experiences of circles. And this may go on at an enormous information data rate, in my opinion. I have no idea exactly, but it is captured, I think, by William James and his notion that the mind is a blooming, buzzing confusion of many things floating by in the stream of consciousness or unconsciousness. The subconscious, I guess I should say, subconscious, is many, many things going on, only some of which come up, bubble up to our attention. We briefly focus attention on one of the many things that are being called to mind by our experiences. And the things called to mind are past experiences that resemble in some way our current experience. And our mind is actively working to bring back those earlier experiences to provide the context, which is in turn going to give us the, quote, meaning. That meaning for a human being, and even for some animals who can't express what they think things mean, it's the past experiences in their lives that have put into their minds enough knowledge to deal with their circumstances. Now, as you get lower and lower among biological organisms, clearly they have less and less of a mind than an experience recorder. But arguably, Eric Kandel has found them all the way down to that slug creature that he's made a study of. The creature has only 28 neurons, but they can be given long-term potentiation, he calls it, which reminds them that they ought to react to a stimulus. That's way too technical. Let's go back to a human being. I'm arguing that we have in our minds already experiences. And let's see what we do with that. So what I'm saying here is that knowledge can be defined as information in minds. That's a mapping, a partial mapping, because there's no way what's in the mind has all the information about the object out there or the concept or whatever we're dealing with. But to the extent that there is a mapping and an isomorphism to the information structures in the external world, like circles and other people, Information philosophy is a correspondence theory. A correspondence theory is the simple notion that there's something in the world and there's something in our mind that knows that about the world. Now, sadly, I point out, there is no isomorphism, no information in common between words and objects. Fernando Saussure famously pointed out that the word for horse in French and the word for horse in English are not intimately involving any sort of information similarity or information content. They are arbitrary symbols, okay? The idea of an arbitrary symbol is often attributed to Saussure because he said these symbols were arbitrary, and he did a study of signs, which in America is called semiotics. In Europe tends to be called semiology or semiology. And of course, Charles Sanders Peirce did this great work in semiotics in the English language, told us the difference between different kinds of signs. He imagined that there were some signs which were totally arbitrary, and I think he did that before Saussure. He also pointed out, though, that some words are iconic, like the tintinnabulation of the bells, which seems to give us, in the wording, in the flow of sounds, an imitation of the bells themselves. So it has an iconic relationship, much like a picture of a house looks like a house. And we can have icons that immediately carry our image, some aspect of our image of the thing, and that's an icon for Peirce. And the third kind of symbol for Peirce was the index, in which somehow there was a connection, like an index finger pointing to my glasses, say. And so there's this, we're pointing to something, and one of the examples was that smoke coming up seems to point to fire. And there are other things in which the connection, there is a connection between the word and the object we're using the word for. We're using a sign, and Saussure described the connection between them as a signifier, like the icon, or the word circle, and the signified, which is somehow for Saussure a concept which is something like an object, but the fact that it's an abstract concept is very important because Saussure was famously the creator of structuralism, the argument that there are things in the world that are structures, and that's what we're signifying with our signifiers. Then there came a time, however, especially in France, and it invaded the US back in the 80s big time, with the idea of post-structuralism, getting beyond structuralism and recognizing that human language is sort of trapped, what Roland Barthes called, in a circle of signifiers, that all the signifiers, the words that we use in our texts, always are defined or understood only by their connection to other signifiers. When we look up something in a dictionary, it's defined with words. And although I don't accept fully the criticism of the post-structuralists or the postmodernists or the deconstructionists who want to argue like Barthes and then famously Jacques Derrida that there's nothing outside the text, says Derrida. Everything is text. Even the world he wants to regard as text. And so the idea that we can get a meaning out of something by traveling in a dictionary, you'll always just come back around in what I think is a virtuous circle of meaning. I do believe we do get to meaning, unlike the postmodernists. But I agree with postmodernists that the meaning we find is usually in ourselves. It's in our culture, and it's under our control, and we invent a great deal of what our world is. And so for humans in the humanities, in literature and so forth, the meaning that's there was invented and put there by us. And when Derrida argues that there's nothing outside the text, he falls down in understanding of science, in understanding of our attempt to get to the fundamental nature of reality. And that, of course, is what I'm defining as my mission for information philosopher, It's to make a connection between what we know and what we think we know and what we think we understand, and the world out there that is in fact there for us, and an objective world outside of ourselves where we simply can't invent the way the world is, however we would like it to be. A great deal of what goes on in science today, sadly, is scientists putting their own ideas on how the world ought to be and developing a theory in accord with that, which is an attempt to be consistent with not only their own thinking, but usually their own culture. Many, many thinkers, great thinkers, the greatest, have all been, from time to time, tripped up by the idea that they have a belief of the way the world ought to be, and their work reflects that, or is in fact trapped by that preconception that they have of the world, which then invades or infects their conceptions. So my goal, and I think I now say something about it, I say here there's no isomorphism between words and objects. And that accounts for much of the failing of philosophy in the past century, in my opinion. Although language is an excellent tool for human communication, it is always ambiguous and ill-suited to represent the world directly. I'm now going to argue that human languages do not picture reality, as Wittgenstein famously hoped in the first work he did with Bertrand Russell. Their goal was to create a logical positivism. A positivism is said to be free of metaphysics and religion and other belief systems, but unfortunately Russell and Wittgenstein, his student, did not escape the problem that human languages are created and full of ambiguities. In the later work, Wittgenstein famously walked away from his early thinking as just a lot of simplistic nonsense that he thought, as Russell had thought, he could come up with logical atoms, tiny little bits out of which you could create logical molecules. Well, maybe they would be like words in sentences, and they would be perfectly defined, and you would develop a first and second order logic which allowed you to build up the entire understanding of the world if we had the right logical atoms, which are something like concepts or words. Instead, I argue that information I see as the lingua franca of the universe. The universe is written in information, in bits and bytes of modern digital information, arguably, and that's a little controversial, but I think I can make the case that the world is digital in the sense that the fundamental atoms, the material atoms and their elementary particles, which unfortunately they're not non-cuttable. The atom idea in the hands of the Greeks was that they were the things that could not be further divided, further cut. A cut is a tomography, right, in our scanners, and an atom is an alpha privative, which means no cutting. An atom is, don't come here and try to cut me open and discover my electrons and protons, neutrons, quarks, etc. But atom is digital. Atom is discrete as opposed to continuous. There are many, many physicists for many years who were pretty convinced that the universe could be made out of continuous fluids and solids, and they were something they were. The Greeks had said, well, you know, there are different liquids for solids, and they seem to be made out of different things, but if we cut them open and got smaller and smaller parts of them, we might get down to something where we can't cut any further. That would be the fundamental building block of the universe. Well, physicists have in fact discovered the fundamental building blocks of the universe, and you need to know them, and I hope to make that visible and clear, that we do understand the atoms. You may remember in our Richard Feynman lecture, Feynman was telling us that if all of knowledge was to disappear, and if you could just say one thing, if culture and science came back to life in a future time, and your job was to pass on the most important information you could give to a surviving society who is trying to understand the nature of reality, Feynman says, you would tell them everything's made out of atoms. And I love that, because I see that as sort of part of my task. My task is to tell the world through my website, which I hope will long survive me. I'm designing in the technical possibility that that will be the case, but I'm very nervous because digital information is very fragile, easily destroyed by those in the universe whose specialty is disinformation or misinformation or fake news, as they call it these days, and large totalitarian states who control completely the kind of information that their subject, in the case of the totalitarian, their citizens, in the case of democracies, will say, are allowed to know about. Telling them that we are made of atoms is step one in my view of understanding everything. But step two is to say it is not the atoms that we are. We're made out of atoms, but we are not our atoms. You have to go beyond that. What you have to go to is the arrangement of the atoms. And that is information. The arrangement of the atoms, where the atoms are the same as any other arrangement, points out the special nature of ones that are arranged to become, for example, the galaxies, the stars, and the planets. Those are information structures, and they have meaning in the sense that we can look at them and recognize them as something different from a pile of random atoms spread around chaotically throughout the universe. A star is a very important spherically symmetric object, a beautiful object. It provides us with the negative entropy, the free energy that we need to survive, and so forth. So at that point, we're talking about the arrangement of the atoms. But it isn't just the arrangement. In order to understand ourselves, we have to also understand that something is maintaining the arrangement that's needed for me to be a living, breathing, thinking, talking human being. And what is it that's in charge of our maintenance of our information structures? And that means down from the top level of my mind, which is pure information embodied in my brain. It's all my experiences that have been recorded there and are retrievable. We have to record them and also then be able to retrieve that information. But that's true all the way down to the tiniest cells. Cells are working very hard in our bodies, and they're dying, and they need to be replaced. And they're replaced at a phenomenal reproduction rate. A phenomenal information data rate is involved in our human body to support this little bit of stuff that goes on up in the thinking level. The information I process in a sentence like this can be put down in bits and bytes and put onto a web page right here just easily, but it's an unbelievably small fraction of all the information processing that's going on biologically in my body to keep me able to do this sort of thing. I have a great appreciation for how minimal our knowledge is compared to the total amount of information in the universe. And that part of the universe that's biological, that's been evolving thanks to our Darwinian evolution, and giving us the power to get better and better and better at information replication and information use, management, information management. And I wish I had a better word for this. I'm still struggling. But information, we use information to maintain our bodies at the highest level, all the way down to the cells. And when you get to the cells and go down again, you get down to these extraordinary, tiny, infinitesimally small, biologically small molecular machines that are involved in reproducing our blood cells. 200 million of which died, actually in that sentence, several billion of my red blood cells died, and they're now being reassembled, rebuilt, new ones shipped out so as to keep me living. These little machines really need serious study, and that's why they're on my homepage at Information Philosopher. Okay, let's get back to the subject at hand, which is meaning in information. And I say here that the extraordinary connection between words and objects is made in human minds, mediated by the brain's experience recorder and reproducer. Okay, this is a concept that I've developed from the work of Donald Hebb, which we lectured about a couple of weeks ago. Words, in order to understand them, they must stimulate neurons to start firing and to play back any similar experiences that include relevant objects and events that we've experienced in the past that are related to the new word or idea. Now, it's not just words that recall or retrieve related experiences. When something flashes in the corner of my eye and my attention is drawn to something there, all those experiences I've had that relate to the sudden new thing that I see are coming right up in order to help us to interpret, which is to say give meaning to this thing that's suddenly taken my attention. William James has an absolutely wonderful discussion, explanation of how this all works, and it's sad that for 100 years he was considered, mind was considered metaphysical, and James's ideas were hardly discussed in psychology departments or philosophy departments, certainly around our country. So then the argument goes that neurons are wired together. Neurons that have been wired together in our earliest experiences, those are our early learning of our knowledge, those will fire together at a later time, and they will then contextualize our new experiences, giving them meaning. And by replaying any emotional reactions that we had to those in similar earlier experiences, it makes them into subjective experiences, giving us the feeling of, quote, what it's like to be and solving the hard problem of consciousness in my mind. And that's a subject we took up in the very first lecture related to David Chalmers and the so-called hard problem. Well, now we're here at Gottlob Frege, and he famously drew a distinction between the reference of a word and the name of the word, and the sense or the meaning or the concept involved in a word. But few people know, I find, that Frege limited his sense to the everyday meaning. For the most part, it was the everyday meaning attached to a given word by the users of a language. It's very interesting. Frege already sees that words are cultural, dependent on the local language used by that culture, and there is generally a standard everyday meaning that's associated with the word, and that's something we all learn together as we grow up, and it's necessary for us to communicate with others using our speech or our writing and so forth. So far, so good. Frege gets the idea, but the idea that that's the only possible idea, the only possible sense of a word, he now refines in a way that I find very, very powerful. He also described the idea of the, quote, idea or representation. Vorstellung is representation, famously used in the work of, I guess, Kant had a lot to do with representation. Schopenhauer, just after him, wrote a great book, The World as Will and Representation. So will was their Wille, the striving, action-oriented part of life in particular. And he thought the world as a whole had this sort of striving, or this will. And then will and representation. Representation was Wille und Vorstellung, which is this idea. What Frege was saying was that the idea that would form in the mind of a given message receiver, so let's imagine we get a word coming into us, this, he said, and this is the powerful part of Frege, which I find not really often described in his work, it would depend, he said, on the peculiar experiences of each person. And I've got a link here. If you work from my blog, you can click to the sense and reference paper that I put on Gottlob Frege's page. This distinction is also the difference between intention and extension in the works of many philosophers. It's in Quine, it's in quite a few others. I should provide a link to them here. I think we could probably see that by going to the internalism and externalism page. Let me just hold down this link and see if I can open it in a new tab. And I can go there for just a moment. So here I'm discussing, let me open the page, the Frege work. And just see, here are some of the examples that Rudolf Carnap of the Vienna Circle was one who developed the ideas of intention and extension. Down below here, Willard van Orman Quine used the terms meaning and reference for intention and extension. Do I have any others? Not really, but the ones I'm thinking of are people who are in epistemology, and I could probably quickly go here for just a moment, open this up. What we have here are a large number of philosophers that are epistemologists that I've studied, and they're really involved, worried about the difference between internalism and externalism. And it corresponds more or less precisely to this notion between what Quine called word and object and what Frege has been pointing out. And on my knowledge page on the website, I have, besides my usual list of all the philosophers on the left-hand side, I also have a list of the technical terms of epistemology, and there are many of them here. You see the idea of correspondence is here. Okay, let me come over here. The idea of correspondence is here. The idea of meaning is discussed here. Mental causation, reductionism, and so forth. So let's go back to my blog, and that's, I guess, the end of what I wanted to say to you, because this Frege distinction is also the basis for a very large amount of work over there in the area of knowledge. How do we know what we think we know? How do we really know it, and so forth? Okay, so I want to go back a bit to the fact that I'm responding to a commentator's question, because this commentator pointed out that I hadn't actually been responding to his comments, and he had to send an email to me saying, why aren't you responding to my comments? And I realized that I need to know better how to put my lectures on this blog, where if you go down a ways in the blog, you'll see we did a lecture on Einstein recently, and I think at the bottom of that, wow, such a long reference, I have a link to the lecture I gave, and that's a link to it on YouTube. But when people comment on YouTube, it's not the same as commenting on this blog, which I see their comments and they get sent to me as an email. I'm trying to figure out how to get notifications, they're called, from my YouTube versions of the lectures and from my Facebook. I get a large number of notifications from Facebook, an old Facebook that I've had for years, but my new one, which is for Information Philosopher, I'm not getting any, I'm not getting many comments, but I would like very much to get the comments so I can reply to those of you who out there are trying to understand what I'm doing and help me with doing what I'm doing. So I thought I would turn from the question of meaning and information to how you can get information and meaning out of my website. Because I've spent almost 20 years trying to get together my thoughts about what information is and why language and logic are wonderful constructions, but they are not necessarily able to get us down to the nature of reality, starting with atoms, and then this notion that it's not the atoms, it's the arrangement of the atoms. And it's not just the arrangement of the atoms that we get from gravity and electromagnetism and nuclear forces pulling matter together into things like the galaxies, the stars, and the planets. That creates wonderful information structures without which we have no chance of being here, but they are passive information structures. In no way are they controlling what they are. As soon as life appeared on our planet, and by chance, the fundamental notion of Darwinian variation of little information structures and their means of reproducing themselves, that change by chance may be deleterious, but it may be advantageous, and if the change improves reproductive success, it starts to be a more successful organism and maybe eats up the other more primitive guys, and anyway grows and grows and comes to be all the way up to thinking beings like ourselves. So that's my picture, and I intend to defend it for you all over this website, My Information Philosopher. In order to explain to you how I do it, let's go into a page like Gottlob Frege. And my goal with the Gottlob Frege page was to describe his work and his relationship to Bertrand Russell, even Alfred North Whitehead, who worked with Russell. And let me see, I wanted to go to this one, and for some reason I'm not going. There we go. The whole story of logical positivism. And then Frege, I connect back to Gottfried Leibniz, and I tell the story of his article called Concept Writing, in which he really built a whole system of modern logic, as I say. And how do I do this? I guess what I want to ask is, why on this page did I not have a reference to the work? When my correspondent asked me about the connection between meaning and information, and he thought I hadn't given a good explanation, and he couldn't see the connection between meaning and information because a large number of people don't see it. They see information as communication of bits and bytes over communication channels, like Claude Shannon, the great Bell Labs pioneer and a partner in creating our digital computers with Alan Turing and John von Neumann. Shannon had given us this kind of dry information that's being communicated, but what about the meaning for human beings in our literature and so forth? And that's a very complicated subject, because the meaning, to me, depends, it will be different for every person. Undeniably, persons in another culture have quite a different set of values. They have quite a different set of concepts they work with, and they may be conflicting with ours, and they're not definable in a kind of universal way, which is, you could imagine, my goal as a philosopher is to come up with the most objective and universal attempts to understand what's going on in the world. But a lot of what goes on in, quote, meaning, when it implies values and it implies a culture, which is what produces our literature, so forth, those are not going to be objective, independent of the human beings, the creative human beings, as I try to establish our freedom, our free will, which gives us our ability to create. And we can create all kinds of wonderful things in science, which allows us to understand the world as we figure out how it works. But we can also create things that have nothing to do with the world. They only have to do with other human beings or our lives. So that gets us into this complex area. So as I responded with email to my correspondent today, I said I wanted to tell him about Frege. And I looked at my web page, and I didn't find on that page, this is going down the page, and this is a very important part of his work on the concept writing, which I've given in English on one side, okay, German on one side, English on the other side, for those of you who understand. I often do that with a very important speaker of another language. I feel I ought to give you the resources on the website that you should be able to, in case you want to go as deeply as anyone. And you remember I did this, let's see, I'm trying to go down. I think I finally put something. Here's something on necessity, which Frege contributed a lot to. It leads to problems like the necessity of identity. Truth is said to be something which is true and eternally true. A truth cannot be true sometimes and not true in other times. However, can be a concept which has a truth value or a value for a certain culture. And that same concept is not true in another culture, because you all recall Protagoras and the idea that, or Wittgenstein, the meaning is in our use of the meaning. We bring the meaning to a concept by its use. Or, as Protagoras said, man is the measure of all things. It's man that gives that gives things their meaning, their values, and so forth. Clearly, because humanity is the one that's going around claiming that some things are good or some things are bad. My goal in my values section of my website is to get beyond the notion that values are subjective. Of course, they are subjective for the most part between different cultures, but ethicists, of course, search for those common values that might be shared across all humanity, if any. And my goal is to find out whether there are values outside of humanity. And not everything can be based on a humanistic ethics, which is built by a given culture. And today, many ethicists have become bioethicists. Their concern is with all life. And the value or the sources of value to living things that are shared throughout all living things, and so forth. And I think that's a wonderful development of bioethics in the direction of getting outside of any human society. But I want to go even farther. I want to say that, is it possible that there's an objective value outside even of our Earth, which is somehow the prerequisite, the precondition for anything of value to exist in the universe? And I believe I've discovered it in the form of negentropic, they're called, information structures, which have somehow escaped from the second law of thermodynamics, which says that any order or information or any value is going to be destroyed in time, because the second law says everything runs down, the universe is running down, there's no running up anywhere. Well, that was a 19th century view which has been proven wrong, but it isn't easy to explain to anyone so far. My own attempt to do this has been limited so far, but I believe I can show how it is the expansion of the universe has opened up possibilities for rearranging those atoms. So Feynman is right. We need to know that we're atoms, but we also need to know something first given to us by Arthur Stanley Eddington, a great cosmologist and astronomer who took the expansion of the universe as an idea that he showed us the arrow of time, the direction of time. It then seemed as if time was heading us toward a heat death in the 19th century, but we now know it's not heading towards, it is heading towards a certain kind of heat death, and the entropy is going up, but there are also information structures forming in the universe, the most interesting of which, for me, are living things and human beings, and our increasing knowledge, which is a kind of information. And at the bottom, it's that creation of information that is my work as an information philosopher, to take an overlook above and beyond words, philosophical concepts, to what's going on that underlies this whole process of being a philosopher or a scientist. So here I finally come down to the bottom of this page, and I have a section called Frege on meaning. But this wasn't here this morning. I wrote this whole section by doing a couple of things. First, I went and made a search of the entire website. Let me show you how easily that's done. Let me go here for a moment. Here's one of my web pages. I can click in my search box, and it's interesting, I see some errors with that page we'll come back to later. Let's just type in meaning, because my correspondent commentator asked for the connection between meaning and information. Well, if I click on that, I see right off the bat, it gives me the page called Intention and Extension, which has been our subject, because it's Frege who first pointed out the possibility for what we think in our minds may be different for every person for objects outside of ourselves, because each of us have different experiences. So I immediately went to that page, and let's jump back to what we wrote on the Frege page, and I added in, you see, right at the beginning, Frege famously distinguished intention and extension, or as Van Quine called it, ostension, pointing at the things that are out there by these German words. And now here's a description of what Frege did that I added into my post, my announcement of this lecture today. And here is a quote from Frege's article called Sense and Reference, down here in the tiny type. And that basically is an English translation of his Sinn und Bedeutung, and I have put that on the website. So let's see what happens if I just click on Sense and Reference, hold it down, and ask for it to come up in a new tab. And click over to that tab. And here I've taken an article which I have access to, privileged access to, because I am Harvard faculty, and I'm not supposed to publish this or in unacceptable ways. And so let me just comment on that for a moment. Here's an article. Let me enlarge it a bit to show you. It's wonderful that I can do this. And here we go. Sense and Reference by Gottlob Frege. My work as an information philosopher, my goal of the website is to give you all the information that you need to understand what I need, what I think I understand, okay? And I don't know who of you out there someday. Today, you know, you're a very small group of people listening to my lecture. I'm in second month, and I have hundreds of views, which is very nice. But frankly, I probably need the kind of views I have on Information Philosopher website. We're up 2 million unique visitors over 20 years, which is quite wonderful. But I don't know how many of them are listening to my lectures, because I've just started this business of going up on YouTube and Facebook and so forth. But I've just shown you I could link from a link on my one page to a PDF reprint of the translation of Gottlob Frege's article. Now, I'm sure I know, really, that out there are very, very few people who can get such a reference. So my goal is to interpret the rules of J-star liberally and agree with them that what they're trying to do is provide academics with knowledge. And I want to extend that to those of you who want to be an inquirer, want to be a philosopher, want to know what can be known by the best thinkers. And so I put this on my website. Let's come back here to this one for a moment, and we scroll down, and the next thing we see is meaning. There's a page on meaning on the Information Philosopher. There's also a page, I didn't pay attention to this one today, on intersubjectivism, because knowledge is not subjective. It depends on the experiences of the thinker. And so, and here's a persistent archive. Wow, that's a wonderful thing. I'd love to interrupt for a moment and just talk about that one. Here's inference to the best explanation, and that's one of the great thinkers who's an epistemologist has got this argument. And here's a correspondence theory of truth. Lots of things, all of which are more or less going to discuss this. I'm going to leave persistent archive on the screen there for just a moment, and I'm going to come back to this fact that I have a document up there for you. Much of my website consists of pages that I have written, but what's on each web page, as far as I can manage it, consists of me quoting from the works of the people I'm writing about. So here we are on the Frege page again, and I just want to show you my method of working. The large text at the top is my words. The indented, it's called the block quote material, is a quote from Frege, and then at the bottom there's a reference to his sense and reference, which is kind of ironic. So that's how I work. I write a page, I read a lot about a philosopher or a scientist, and and that sometimes means several books. I have thousands of books in my information philosopher library. When I get to the point where I think I understand the most important parts of their work, I create a web page. If that person is living, I send them a copy of the web page and say, am I getting this right? Because a lot of people are reading my pages and I want to make sure, and I'm quoting this or that. Some of them write back and say, well, would you add this or that, or I've got something wrong, in which case this is great. I look forward to that always, because I need user feedback. But what I've built then is this website, and I want to tell you a couple of things about the website. Let me first go to our meaning page again on this screen and show you something. I hope this will work. Let me do it in the screen, and in order to do it in the screen, I've got to put my ATEM in the box with that particular page. 20 or more years ago, my son Derek and I met with Tim Berners-Lee, and I'll just look at a bit for a moment at the book that I read before I went to MIT and heard him give a lecture on his creation of the World Wide Web. This man has really given us HTML, the coding system with tags like A and B for bold and so forth. And at the end of his lecture, Derek and I went up and talked to him and asked him a couple of questions, one of which was, what do you see for the future of the web? What would you like to be working better? And that was really an important moment because Berners-Lee said, I will tell you how it could be better, he said, and he asked me for the copy of his book that I was brought to him. And he opened up the book and he wrote into the cover, and I'll show you what he wrote. I need to perhaps zoom in a little bit here to kind of let you see it a little more clearly. I'll back up a little bit. He wrote this link, which I believe is still around today. It says http:// written by the inventor of http and // and then www.w3.org/design-issues/generic and or /tr or /rdf. Okay? Here are my notes on his lecture and reading his book. But in any case, Derek and I went back, and one of the things that Berners-Lee had asked for was to solve a problem which was his greatest disappointment with the web. It was that pages that he found very interesting and which he wanted to use later, at a later time when he went to link to them, the link went away. It was gone. And that's still happening today, but for the Great Internet Archive Project, which is saving copies every now and then of all the pages on the web. It's a massive project in the US and Canada, and I'm so very happy with that. I use it a lot. But he wanted what he called a persistent archive, and that's what he wrote here when I looked at his design issues. So my son Derek and I went back, and we basically developed a persistent archive, by which I mean I'm now going to hold down a shift key on my keyboard and click on this page. Okay, so what I have brought up is an HTML editor for this page, but more importantly, I'm in the current page, which I wrote back in 2018, sort of interesting, and I can also look at the series manager and see that I've made 3 versions of this page. Now let me close this one because, and I can edit any of these, and the first one was written in 2015. Let me close this page, and let me go to my home page and do the same thing. I'm actually just going to hold down my shift key, and I'm going to click on the page. Let me then scale this down a little bit so more of it fits on the page. And the important thing here is all of the HTML and the words of my home page on the website. But up here, I want to look at the series manager. And the series manager now tells me that I first wrote a draft of this page back in 2004. Okay? And I'm not sure I can exactly remember how to click and see what you're looking at right here is what Tim Berners-Lee asked for. A persistent archive of everything I've written in case he liked the version number 37 better than the 47. And so everything I've done for the last 15 or 20 years has been recorded and kept in a way that I can click a time in the past and go back and look at the way the website looked at that date. I call it a website recorder. And I've had some success with this tool, and I want to point out that when I log in, there are many things I can do. This supports a large member database. It has forums, it has talks, which are like PowerPoint talks. It has reservation systems that have been used for events. Tennis court, for example, I built at one time. It has a lot of other things, a shopping system, and several other things. And this drop-down tells me what I can do with the pages part of my website. Now I want to point out, let's see if I can come to, this view is fine. I want to point out that my membership allows me to get individuals to become members of my Information Philosopher website. And when you become a member someday, I hope there'll be many of them when I'm gone, you will have editing privileges, page by page or section by section, to improve and maintain and grow the website the way the living things inside me maintain themselves and grow themselves, so that we can think of the Information Philosopher website as a growing system. And it will be there for people in the indefinite future. Okay, well, we're running out of time, but I wanted to give you this flavor of what it is to be an information philosopher. Is partly to learn what I've learned that I think you should learn in order to be able to do philosophy better than it can be done with talking about it and debating and having verbal squabbles, and my words are better than your words and my concept is more accurate than your concept. And conceptual analysis is definitely an interesting thing to do, and being logical is a very powerful thing to be, and so forth. But if you don't know what's going on at the bottom level of the universe and how it is come up from atoms to the arrangement of atoms, and from the arrangement of atoms being done by physical forces over to the arrangement of atoms being done by living things who use information processing to manage the arrangement of the information into little machines inside cells, cells themselves, and then multicellular organisms up to living thinking beings like philosophers. That's a story I need to make you familiar with, all the way from the tiniest actions going on in elementary particles forming atoms up to these molecular, miraculous little miniature machines inside our bodies that are maintaining us for decades. In my case, I'm in my 9th decade, and I want you to understand that and to realize that it's critically important to understand all of that information processing which controls the matter and energy flows through our body in order to prepare you to be an information philosopher in the coming decades. For you, you have a lot more of them, some of you young people, than I do. And for, in my imagination, for anyone in the world who wants to join in. I'm now working on tools that allow me to translate my website into 40 languages, thanks to Google. At the moment I have 5 of them here under my translation drop-down, but I hope to develop many more in the coming days with your help, I hope. So thank you very much for listening today, and thanks to the commentator who criticized my poor explanation of the connection between meaning and information. I am trying my best to get that out there for you.